I would say to us, we have to now begin to think about addressing climate change in a very intersectoral way. We have to recognize that there's hope in how we deal with the crisis. If our government and other governments across the world make serious investments now in growing our solar capability, wind, wave, biothermal, geomass, and so on, not only do we address climate change, but we can generate millions of decent jobs in a new energy environment. Greenpeace has done a study which you are welcome to look up on our website called the Energy Revolution, where we put together about 40 think tanks to look at, is it possible for us to meet the energy needs that we genuinely have for growing economies, and can we do it without fossil fuels, oil, coal and gas, and also nuclear? Can we actually meet it? And we show that with a twin-track strategy of ambitious investment in renewable technologies on the one hand, and serious investments in energy efficiency on the other, we can actually ensure that we meet our energy needs on the one hand, but also to drive our economies, but don't harm the environment. Now, of course, many people in the fossil fuel industry and so on scoff at this, just as people in the nuclear industry were scoffing at us last year when we were saying that, in fact, we were extremely worried about safety standards at nuclear facility, particularly those that were on earthquake fault lines. And it's one of the worst things about being an activist, and that is you don't want to say that I was right? Because you almost desperately want to be wrong, because if you are right, the implications of being right are just so devastatingly painful. So that T-shirt which says "No Planet B" is because we don't have a plan B, right? We have to get this right, and maybe I can just quickly tell you one analysis of why I think climate change activism is so difficult. I would say there are 3 points. One is, with human rights activism or anti-poverty activism, you can take a camera, show a homeless person, and people can understand the pain of homelessness that comes from poverty, and they get it immediately. With human rights violation, if somebody's been tortured, you can show the scar and so on, people can see it. Because climate change impacts have accumulated over 200 years, since the age of industrialization, it's to say, hey, that thing there, the water's gone up around your island in the Pacific or in Bangladesh, where already we are seeing millions of climate refugees because people are having to move because sea level rise has contaminated the groundwater table and has pushed people into slums and so on. But because those things happen slowly over time, it's not immediate, you can't communicate. So the challenge to all of us is to be more creative about how we actually communicate the complexity of this change. The second problem is the science. Not that the science is not clear. The science is 100% clear. But it's the way we talk about the science. And maybe if I can do it in an anecdote. When I came back from the Copenhagen Climate Summit in December 2009, I went and collapsed with my brother in Durban at his place. And after 2 days, he allowed me to recover. And he said, let's talk politics. And he says, hey, have you forgotten everything you learned as a grassroots organizer? I said, why do you say that? He said, I was watching you and your colleagues from Greenpeace and all these other organizations from Copenhagen. And he said, man, between your degrees, your targets, your percentages, your parts per million, I was completely lost. He happens to be a former political prisoner, a professor of optometry. In fact, 2 years ago, he was voted the International Optometrist of the Year. So this is a seriously bright guy, trying to follow and understand what's happening. And he gets the basics, but he was getting lost. So he's saying, you folks have to learn to speak in a way that ordinary people can understand. So if any one of you here has any confusion about exactly what it means about sea level rise and what it means when we say we must make sure that global temperatures do not go up by more than 1.5 degrees and so on, and you feel, hey, maybe I'm a bit silly, let me say to you, it's not your problem. It's the problem of those of us who are actually trying to do the activism to get the message across. But the third and the most important problem is the fact that on this issue, activism comes up against the most powerful global lobby that has existed in the past and that exists today, and that is the power of the fossil fuel industry, particularly in the United States and to a lesser extent in Europe. I mean, the best example, shining example, is dear old President George Bush Jr. Who was he? He was essentially an agent of the fossil fuel industry. The fossil fuel industry bought that election for him, catapulted him into the White House. I mean, an election that he lost, as history will eventually record, when the Freedom of Information Act in the US allows the proper counting of the votes in Florida and so on. But he served in the 8 years the fossil fuel industry extremely well. So today, if you look at the people who have the greatest access to power, it's folks in the energy industry and particularly in the dirty energy industry. That is a fact of life. And I would just say in our country, we have to be very, very careful that those folks in the polluting industries, some of whom are genuinely trying to do the right thing. I've met with some of them. I appreciate their efforts. And I don't say this, in a critical way. But I would challenge all of us to be vigilant, to make sure that there's transparency about the energy choices that we make in South Africa, and to recognize that in South Africa, we have immediately a serious water crisis that is looming, that if we do not address the issue of the acid drainage water that we are seeing from mining, if we do not take serious consideration of what the climate science is talking about, a devastating drought in terms of the climate patterns by 2025, 2030, the violence we saw here in 2008, tragic as it was, when we attacked our brothers and sisters from countries that provided us with solidarity, support, and refuge when we were in exile. One of the saddest moments of my life, when I believe a part of me died, when as a society we were not able to stand up and say this is wrong, then I will tell you the scale of the violence will be something incomprehensible if we do not actually get this right, start thinking about how we address the issue of water scarcity, water sovereignty, and to all companies that use water for their businesses, whether it's Eskom that uses 2% of all water, or whether it's the agricultural industry which uses 60% of water because of not upgrading the technological skill, know-how and skills and operating in ways that are not environmentally friendly, we have a serious problem. So much as I would conclude by saying on this point that there are many, many positive steps that are being taken by the South African business community which we welcome, I would say that perhaps the South African business community is way ahead of some of the, through big chunks in the US, for example. But I would say, if we are brutally honest, we have a long, long way to go before we can say that we are addressing the problem with the urgency that it actually calls for. So let me conclude by just boring you a little bit with the climate negotiations, right? Because it's going to happen in our country, and it's a special moment, I think. And I think we should, I think it's worth taking a few minutes just to explain what it means and so on, right? What we're trying to do. So in Copenhagen, we said, that was in 2009, we said we were wanting to get a fab deal, right? Not a fabulous deal, but a fair, ambitious, and binding deal. By fair, we mean that we need a treaty where governments of the world come together and agree what everybody knows is that poor developing countries have been least responsible for the climate catastrophe that we find ourselves in. And therefore, while we have common responsibilities, we also have to have differentiated responsibilities as well, based on the level of culpability that historically we have seen. But it doesn't mean that developing countries have to bury their head in the sand and say, oh, okay, we didn't create the problem, therefore we have a lesser burden. Because in the end, we either get this right as rich and poor countries acting together and we secure the future for all our children and grandchildren, or if we get it wrong, we all go down together. And part of that fairness is significant support by rich countries for developing countries in terms of climate finance to help with mitigation and to help with adapting our economies and societies to be able to deal with some of the impacts. And the figure that we've been calling for is $140 billion a year to go into a climate finance fund. The governments finally have agreed to $100 billion. But I ask you this, right? If governments in the rich countries of the world were able to, virtually overnight, to find not millions, not billions, but trillions of dollars to bail out their banks, their bankers, and their bonuses, why can't they find, in the trillions of dollars, why can't they find a fraction of that money to bail out the planet, bail out the poor, and bail out our children and grandchildren's future? The word ambitious is saying not that what's okay now is baby steps in the right direction, which is what happens in Copenhagen and also in Cancun. We need a level of ambition is equal to what the science tells us we have to do. And already, the science is telling us a scary story. They're saying that emissions must peak by 2015 and start coming down shortly thereafter. And we are not anywhere close to making that happen with the level of inertia, particularly on some of the biggest polluting countries in the world. Binding, the B in FAB, why binding is because we know from UN summits, it's very easy for our governments to come together, agree, nice words, nice statements, and by the time they even reach the capitals, they forget what they signed on to. We need here a binding agreement that governments can be held accountable to actually deliver on their commitments. Otherwise, we actually are looking at a potential disaster. But we did not, sadly, get a FAB deal in Copenhagen. Instead, we got a FLAB deal in Copenhagen, F-L-A-B, full of loopholes and bullshit. And, you know, we went to Copenhagen, right? We went to Copenhagen and we called, in fact, Copenhagen was renamed Hopenhagen. You know, because the whole world, was like really hoping that because we managed to get heads of state for the first time to come to Copenhagen. Right? President Obama got the Nobel Peace Prize and was going to go there on the day after he got the Nobel Peace Prize. Greenpeace and others waged a campaign saying, right city, wrong date. He had to go back to Copenhagen, to Washington, and still come back. You know, we got them there, and there was this hope that they get it and they will deliver it. President Obama, during the election campaign, there were 3 phrases that he used. The fierce urgency of now. I'm forgetting the second one. Yes, we can, of course. Sorry. Yes, we can. And the third one was a planet in peril. You go back and look at 5 speeches